My name is Carmen Blake. I'm 35 years old, and last Christmas Eve my family finally showed me exactly what they thought I was worth. My sister's little girl grabbed the box out of my hands before I could even sit down. She ripped the paper open, looked at the sketchbook and jewelry kit inside, and scrunched up her face. "Dad says you only buy trash." The room went quiet for half a second. Then her father laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. My sister hid her smile behind her glass. My parents stared at the TV. My own daughter slid a little closer to me on the couch and squeezed my arm, waiting to see if I was going to cry or explode. I didn't do either. I smiled, told my niece she could give it back if she hated it that much, and walked my gift right back out to my car. That night, while they slept under the roof I helped pay for, I logged in and froze every card I could reach. The emergency line of credit, the card I had co-signed, the just-in-case account they swore they barely used. At 8:30 the next morning, their payment was declined at the checkout line. By the time they started blowing up my phone, I already knew this wasn't going to stop at one embarrassing moment in a store. If stories about families crossing lines you didn't even know existed hit a nerve, stay with me until the end. And if you want more real stories where the person being used finally decides they're done, hit like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Later that week, the familiar heaviness settled over me again. The kind that always showed up whenever I tried to make sense of my place in that family. It was strange how quickly the feeling came back, almost like muscle memory. For years I had pushed it down, convinced myself it was normal to be the one holding everything together. Now it felt impossible to pretend I didn't know what that role had cost me. Looking back, the pattern had never been subtle. It started quietly, in the kind of moments most people would overlook. I remembered paying a small bill for my sister because she said she was short that month, and how harmless it felt. Then it became something else entirely. A subscription fee here, a repair there, another expense that seemed urgent and temporary. Each time I told myself I was helping because that was what family did, even when it meant moving my own plans aside. At some point, the line between generosity and responsibility disappeared, and I didn't even notice. My sister always talked about how things were harder for her, how she just needed time to get back on her feet. She said it casually, with an air of expectation that made it sound like the conclusion had already been reached, that I would pick up what she dropped. It never felt like a request, more like a reminder of the role I was expected to fill. I can't pinpoint the exact moment she began assuming I would say yes to everything. Maybe it was the first time I didn't push back. Maybe it was every time after that. There were periods when I told myself I was exaggerating. After all, I wasn't living on the street. I had an apartment, a job, a daughter to take care of. But each new responsibility I picked up for them meant another compromise for us. Money that should have gone to Piper's school activities or to something simple like a weekend outing ended up covering gaps that weren't mine. I didn't realize how much of my life was tied to their decisions until the weight started affecting things I cared about. Sometimes the resentment came in quietly, in the form of small realizations that unfolded long after the moments had passed. I'd think about how many times my sister praised someone else for helping her while conveniently forgetting everything I had done. She wasn't shy about expressing gratitude when it made her look good, but somehow I was always left out of those stories. It was as if my efforts only counted when they benefited her directly, and even then, they barely registered. It became impossible to ignore how often I was expected to sacrifice without acknowledgement. Every financial choice they made, big or small, seemed cushioned by the assumption that I would absorb the fallout. It wasn't spoken aloud, but the expectation was there in the silence that followed every new oversight, every unexpected expense, every crisis that seemed to hit them harder than it ever hit anyone else. I used to convince myself they appreciated me in their own way, that maybe the lack of acknowledgement wasn't intentional, But as the years went on, it became clear they had built an entire routine around the idea that I wouldn't complain. My reliability had become their safety net, and the more I provided, the less they saw it. Dependability turned invisible when it was always available. I learned that the hard way. Even so, I kept stepping in because I didn't want Piper to grow up thinking her mother was bitter or resentful. I wanted her to see generosity as strength, not weakness. But at some point, I began wondering if I was showing her the opposite, that letting people drain you was part of love. That thought lingered longer than I expected, particularly as she got older and started paying attention to things I hoped she wouldn't notice. There were moments when I tried to draw boundaries, but they rarely held. A quiet no would turn into an argument about loyalty or family obligations, and every attempt to hold my ground left me feeling guilty. They had a way of twisting the narrative that made it seem like I was abandoning them, even when I was the one struggling to carry the weight. It was an unspoken rule. Any consequence they faced was somehow my responsibility. Realizing this didn't bring clarity right away, it just added another layer to a truth I had avoided. I spent years believing I was doing what anyone in my position would do, but the more I stepped back and examined the pattern, the clearer it became. I had built my life around solving problems that weren't mine, and the more I stepped in, the more they stepped out. It was only then that I started to understand how long the imbalance had existed and how much of it I had allowed without even realizing it. As the days passed, the tension that had been building for years began to crystallize into something sharper, something I could finally name. It wasn't anger anymore. It was clarity. That distinction mattered more than I expected, because clarity made every decision feel deliberate instead of reactive. It made the next step obvious, even if the weight of it settled on my shoulders in a way that hinted things were about to shift permanently. The night I acted was quieter than usual. Piper had fallen asleep early after a long afternoon working on a project she was excited about, leaving the apartment wrapped in a kind of stillness I rarely experienced. With the rooms dim and the air steady, I opened my laptop and sat at the small dining table that doubled as my workspace. The glow of the screen felt almost intrusive at first, like I was letting light spill into a corner of my life I had kept dark for too long. But once I began, the hesitation disappeared. The list of accounts connected to my name was longer than I remembered. Most of them weren't significant individually, which was probably why I had allowed them to pile up without noticing how much they took from me over time. One payment covered a subscription that was supposed to be temporary. Another was tied to a repair I had treated as a one-time favor. A credit line I had opened for convenience had quietly turned into something else. The pattern was unmistakable. Each item had a story, a reason, an excuse attached to it, small enough to dismiss, yet persistent enough to accumulate. I went through each entry carefully, not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I wanted to understand the shape of everything that had been taken from me. With every switch I flipped off and every access I revoked, I felt something inside me loosen. It wasn't relief exactly. It was more like reclaiming ground I didn't know I had lost. The more I reviewed, the more I realized how often I had allowed myself to be part of situations that drained me without adding anything back. Autopay settings were the first to go. It almost startled me how quickly they disappeared once I pressed the buttons. After that, I changed passwords, removed my name from shared access points, and documented every change. The process wasn't complicated, but each step carried weight. There was no ceremony to it, no moment where I paused to consider whether I was doing the right thing. It felt overdue, even necessary. 2 hours passed without my noticing. By the time I pushed my chair back, the air in the apartment felt different, lighter somehow, as if the room had been holding its breath and finally let it out. I closed the laptop and stood there for a moment, absorbing the quiet around me. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet everything had shifted. My sister and her husband would wake up the next day believing their world was intact, unaware that the ground beneath them had already begun to move. When morning arrived, I carried on with routine tasks, each one grounded me in normalcy. Preparing breakfast, checking Piper's schedule, organizing things around the apartment. None of it felt unusual, and that was the part that surprised me. I had expected some sense of fear or guilt to creep in, the lingering voice that had always persuaded me to soften my boundaries, but it never came. Instead, there was only a quiet confidence that reminded me how long I had ignored my own limits. It wasn't until later that day that the impact of my decisions began to show. I noticed a series of alerts on my phone, the kind that hinted at disruptions happening elsewhere. I didn't open them immediately. Instead, I let them sit there, collecting on the screen like a reflection of consequences that were no longer mine to manage. Each one represented a responsibility I had carried alone for years, redirected back to the people who had created it. As the notifications continued to appear, I realized how rarely I had allowed space between their needs and my response. There had always been an expectation that I would react instantly, step in quickly, fix things quietly. Allowing those messages to remain untouched felt like stepping outside a role I had been assigned without consent. It was strangely empowering. By the time evening settled in, the vibration of my phone had slowed, though not entirely stopped. I set it face down on the table and let the silence return. The day had unfolded without chaos, without confrontation, without any of the emotional spirals I once believed were inevitable whenever I asserted myself. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of separation, thin but unmistakable, between their choices and my life. And as the night drew in again, it became clear that reclaiming that distance was the first real step towards something I hadn't experienced in a long time, living without their constant shadow. By the end of that week, the atmosphere around everything connected to my family had taken on a strange sharpness, as if the edges of situations I once ignored were suddenly impossible to overlook. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was the quiet kind of tension that settles in when the truth finally begins to surface in ways no one can reshape or disguise. I felt it the moment I pulled into my parents' driveway for the next visit, not because anything looked different, but because I was no longer standing in the same place emotionally. Stepping out of the car felt like stepping into a version of myself that had finally stopped shrinking to fit inside their expectations. Inside the house, the rhythm of the day felt familiar, too familiar. The same conversations floated through the rooms, the same subtle dismissals slid into the space between sentences, the same hierarchy pulsed beneath every interaction. For a moment, I watched it all with a kind of detached clarity, noticing details I had overlooked for years. The way certain people position themselves at the center of attention. The way small inconveniences turned into melodramas if the spotlight shifted away from them. The way silence was used as approval or punishment depending on who had earned favor that day. It was a system so well rehearsed it didn't require direction. Even without words, the unspoken expectations landed exactly where they always did. I felt the pressure to smooth things over, lighten the mood, fall back into my assigned role. But this time, the old patterns didn't settle. They hovered there, waiting for me to do what I had always done, unaware that something fundamental had already changed. For the first time in years, I walked through those rooms without bending myself around their comfort. As the day unfolded, I noticed a growing restlessness in the air, a kind of unease that trailed behind interactions in small, almost imperceptible ways. There were glances exchanged across the room, brief moments of calculation, subtle shifts in tone. It was clear that something had been disrupted, though no one addressed it directly. They didn't know the specifics yet, but they understood enough to be unsettled. I could feel the anticipation building, as if everyone was waiting for an explanation they believed they were owed. In the middle of that tension, my mother gestured for me to follow her into the hallway. She handed me a stack of envelopes with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested she didn't want to be involved, but also didn't want to appear uninvolved. She said nothing meaningful, just a brief comment about sorting through mail and coming across something with my name on it. It was the kind of gesture that could easily be interpreted as helpful, though the timing made the act feel too precise to be accidental. When I returned to a quiet corner of the living room and opened the envelope on top, the shift inside me was immediate. The document was a registration form for an upcoming youth program. My name had been written in the section reserved for financial responsibility, and the signature beneath it was a sloppy imitation of my handwriting. Even with minimal effort, the forgery was obvious. The curve of the letters, the spacing, the uneven pressure. It was a performance by someone who believed I wouldn't notice because I never questioned anything. The realization settled over me slowly, not as a shock, but as confirmation of something I had sensed long before that moment. The forgery wasn't simply a request disguised as paperwork. It was a declaration of entitlement. It meant that somewhere along the line, they had stopped seeing me as a person who could choose and started seeing me as a resource they were entitled to use however they wished. The document in my hands was more than a form. It was proof of how far that entitlement had grown and how easily it had been justified among themselves. I stared at the signature for a long moment, letting the truth of it settle. Every choice I had made to be supportive had somehow transformed into permission for them to decide things on my behalf. What struck me wasn't the betrayal itself, but the casualness of it. They had assumed I would go along with it without question because I always had. The forgery wasn't an act of desperation. It was an act of confidence, a belief that I was predictable, compliant, and too focused on keeping peace to challenge anything. As I folded the document and slipped it back into the envelope, a cold clarity settled over me. The truth had been there for years, just hidden beneath layers of obligation and silence. But seeing my name written in a hand that wasn't mine, used in a way I had not agreed to, cut through every excuse I had told myself to preserve the illusion of harmony. In that moment, I understood that nothing about the situation was accidental or misunderstood. It was intentional, practiced, and deeply rooted. And for the first time, I felt something stronger than disappointment. I felt the unmistakable beginning of resolve. A few days later, the unease that had been building beneath everything settled into a kind of determination I could no longer ignore. There was no sudden shift or dramatic realization, just a steady recognition that nothing would change unless I finally confronted the parts of my life I had allowed to be taken over piece by piece. That meant gathering information, facing uncomfortable truths, and stepping into the kind of responsibility that pointed back toward myself instead of everyone else. My first stop was the small bank branch near my apartment, a place I had visited dozens of times without thinking much about it. This time felt different. I arrived with a folder tucked under my arm, filled with documents I had sorted through carefully the night before. The quiet hum of the building and the soft tapping of keyboards blended into a background that allowed me to hear my own thoughts clearly for the first time in a long while. Sitting across from someone who understood financial systems more objectively than I ever could made the entire situation feel more real, more tangible. As I laid out the documents, I noticed the shift in the atmosphere. The papers that had felt like scattered pieces of inconvenience at home suddenly took shape when viewed by someone trained to interpret the details. The bank officer didn't react dramatically. He simply reviewed each item with a kind of measured precision that made the truth impossible to deny. When he pointed out inconsistencies, the implications were immediate. The signature, the access trail, the structure of the account. None of it aligned with what had been presented to me within the family. It was the kind of clarity that came from someone who had no emotional investment in the situation, and that objectivity illuminated everything I had tried to rationalize. Leaving the bank, I carried a weight that was different from guilt or frustration. It was the weight of confirmation, the knowledge that what I had suspected wasn't just a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. It was a pattern, rooted in decisions made long before I ever questioned them. That realization guided me straight to the next step: documenting everything formally. The process was methodical. I sat in a quiet office, explaining details I had once dismissed as minor. As each point was recorded, the bigger picture formed with unsettling accuracy. This wasn't an isolated mistake. The document with my forged signature had been one layer, but now other inconsistencies began surfacing as well. When I reviewed older records that I hadn't touched in months, a pattern of unauthorized actions emerged. The signs had been there, but I had been too focused on keeping peace to notice how easily my name had been used without my knowledge. One discovery led to another. A credit line that should have been closed remained active with subtle activity that didn't match my records. Insurance statements revealed claims tied to circumstances that made no sense in the context of my own life. Even small auto payments showed signs of manipulation, settings altered without my involvement, approvals linked to an email address I didn't recognize. The deeper I went, the clearer it became that the situation reached far beyond the initial document that had triggered everything. It was unsettling to realize how thoroughly the boundaries around my life had been crossed. Not through dramatic actions, but through subtle shifts and quiet adjustments that accumulated over time. Every detail reinforced the same truth. My assumption that the people closest to me respected my autonomy had been misplaced. Their comfort had been built on access to resources that were never meant to be shared without consent. The more I uncovered, the more I understood how long the imbalance had been quietly shaping my decisions. By the time I met with an attorney to outline the next steps, the shock had morphed into something sharper. Sitting in that office, I listened as someone broke down the legal implications in clear, steady terms. There was no judgment in the explanation, only structure, process, and the assurance that I wasn't imagining the severity of what had happened. The recommendations were straightforward: gather all documentation, notify relevant institutions, file the appropriate reports, and begin formally separating every legal and financial tie that remained. Hearing the steps laid out like that made everything feel both heavier and liberating. It wasn't the path I wanted, but it was the path necessary to reclaim control over my own life. Walking out of that office, I carried a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. The situation was no longer tangled in emotional confusion. It was defined, documented, and moving toward resolution through channels that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. As I drove home, the changes ahead didn't intimidate me. They anchored me. For the first time, the direction felt entirely my own. A quiet evening at home should have felt peaceful after everything I had pushed through. Yet a persistent heaviness settled in the room, like it had been waiting for the right moment to appear. I sensed it before I understood it, the way someone senses a storm long before the first drop of rain. It began with a simple email notification from an agency I rarely heard from, something so ordinary at first glance that I almost let it sit untouched. But a tug of intuition pulled me toward it, and that decision shifted the entire direction of the night. The message referenced an account tied to my name, one I had never opened, with a balance that made the air around me tighten. It wasn't the number itself that rattled me, but the timeline, charges stretching back further than I could fathom, recurring with a consistency that suggested deliberate planning rather than a careless mistake. As I scrolled through the details, each line added another layer to a structure I didn't even know existed. It wasn't just unauthorized access. It was a system built quietly, designed to function only because I had never stopped to question the patterns that had shaped my life for years. I stared at the screen while a cold clarity pressed deeper into my chest. There was no confusion left, no angle that could be explained away through generosity or misunderstanding. What I had uncovered earlier had only been the surface, and now the depth beneath that surface stood fully exposed. The realization didn't show up as anger. It arrived as something slower, an understanding of how thoroughly my boundaries had been erased without my consent. I printed every page carefully, adding them to the growing stack of documentation I kept in a folder near my desk. As the pages piled up, the weight of the folder mirrored the weight gathering in my mind. This wasn't a recent betrayal. It had roots, history, and a level of intention that forced me to reevaluate moments I had brushed aside in the past. The small requests, the subtle hints, the favors framed as temporary emergencies, all of it now looked different under the light of what I was holding. Later that night, while organizing the documents chronologically, I noticed a pattern connected to my tax records. A dependent claim that made no sense, filed during a period when my own life had been stable and uneventful. The deeper I checked, the more inconsistencies emerged. Someone had slipped their needs into spaces where only my responsibilities should have existed. It was astonishing how easily a person could justify taking advantage of someone who rarely drew lines. By the time I finished sorting through everything, the apartment had grown completely silent. That silence wasn't comforting. It was reflective, almost instructive, pushing me to acknowledge truths I had been avoiding because they felt too heavy to confront. But avoiding them hadn't protected me. It had only allowed the exploitation to grow more sophisticated. Sitting at the table, I let myself process what this meant, not just logistically, but emotionally. There was a strange numbness to the realization that people I had once trusted had woven themselves so deeply into parts of my life that should have been untouchable. I didn't feel the shock anymore. That stage had passed. What remained was a kind of grounded determination, the understanding that clarity often arrives in uncomfortable forms. As I reviewed the final set of documents, a thought settled over me with a precision that felt almost physical. This wasn't only about undoing damage, it was about reclaiming the parts of my life that had been quietly redirected to serve someone else's comfort. Each page represented a step away from that old dynamic, a step toward a future where I refused to be pulled back into the shadows of someone else's irresponsibility. When I closed the folder, I knew the next actions would carry weight. The separation I had started was no longer just financial. It was structural, emotional, and complete. What had once felt like a painful unraveling now took on the shape of liberation. The final decisions ahead would not be easy, but they would be mine. And that was enough to steady me for what came next. A quiet morning settled over my apartment, carrying a stillness that felt different from the silence I had grown used to. It wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of something steadier, an understanding that the road ahead no longer required negotiation with anyone who had benefited from my hesitation. That calm made it easier to look directly at the final pieces I needed to set in motion. The folder containing every document I had collected rested on the table, thicker now than I ever expected. Its weight wasn't intimidating anymore. It felt like a marker of the distance I had traveled. Sorting through the last few pages, I noticed how differently I processed everything compared to the beginning. There was no fear left, no doubt, only a clear acknowledgement of what needed to be done. Every form, every report, every letter served as a reminder that reclaiming my life required an ending as firm as the intrusion that had triggered it. My next steps unfolded with a kind of precision that surprised me. I filed the final paperwork, notified every institution that still had traces of unauthorized access, removed myself from obligations that had never belonged to me in the first place, and closed the accounts that had been left vulnerable for far too long. Each action felt like shutting a door that should never have been opened. There was a strange peace in that certainty, a sense that I was no longer patching holes, but building new walls designed to protect what mattered. As I moved through the last tasks, I thought about the collapse that must have been happening on the other side of all of this. Not because I wished for it, but because it was the natural outcome of severing systems that had quietly relied on me. The withdrawal of support had been gradual at first, but the final cutoff created an impact that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't my responsibility to manage the aftermath. That truth settled into me like a final piece clicking into place. Later in the day, while reviewing the confirmations that had come through, I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in years. Not relief exactly, something deeper. A quiet conviction that boundaries weren't acts of cruelty, but acts of preservation. The decisions I made weren't about revenge. They were about recognizing the cost of tolerance when it's confused with love. That distinction had taken years for me to understand, and now it felt like the foundation of everything I wanted my life to become. By the time evening arrived, the apartment glowed softly in the fading light, and for once, I didn't feel the tension of waiting for something to go wrong. There were no interruptions, no unexpected issues demanding attention. The stillness felt earned, not borrowed. I knew this chapter of my life was ending, not because anyone apologized or made amends, but because I chose to close it myself. Standing near the window, I let the quiet settle around me and reflected on what all of this had taught me. The hardest truth wasn't discovering how deeply my trust had been misused. It was realizing how easily I had accepted a role that required me to diminish myself for the comfort of others. That habit had shaped years of decisions, and unlearning it took more strength than any confrontation ever could. The lesson wasn't dramatic. It wasn't wrapped in forgiveness or reconciliation. It was simple. People will take as much as you allow, and silence often reads as permission. Protecting yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. And choosing distance doesn't make you heartless. It makes you honest about what your life can hold. As the last bit of daylight faded, I closed the folder for the final time. There was no need to revisit it again. Every step had been taken, every connection severed, every tie formally cut. The chapter had ended exactly as it needed to, without fanfare, without reconciliation, without compromise. What remained was my future, shaped by boundaries that belonged entirely to me. And for the first time, that was enough.